Hello, and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, as you know, we love to talk about what happens on screen. We love to talk about what happens behind the camera. And we like to sometimes talk about what happens a couple of rows behind the camera, where we're not just talking about how the movies and TV shows that we like get made, but how they get talked about, how they get critiqued, how they get praised, and as today's subject will be, how they get awarded. We are in the midst of what I've come to learn now is described as award season, particularly for movies we'll be talking about today. But we just had the Grammys a couple of nights ago. This is when there's the Golden Globes, there's the Foreign Press Awards, there's all sorts of things, all leading up to the granddaddy of them all, the Oscars. And I'm here with podcaster extraordinaire, the person who first brought me into the True Story Network through the Marvel Movie Minute. And it just has a podcast resume a lot longer than I have time to describe, but he'll go and do what he can. Andy Nelson. Andy, how are we doing today?
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate the offer.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, I know I've heard you talk a lot about the problems with the way awards are given and, some of the discussions. You and I have had some great discussions about, how political it is or how the categories get chosen and how sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. And in the age of streaming, all the discussion of just what is a TV show versus a movie and, what Netflix movie should be Emmys or Oscars or all that. And for me, that just kind of starts leading to a question of, well, then why do we care about any of it? And I know you really care, and I've tried to kind of just quit the whole thing. And, like The Godfather, you keep sucking me back in. We'll talk about the problems. Let's just start with, why do you like award season? Why is it important to you?
Well, I think awards. It's important to know that like award season is an opportunity. I mean, I'm one of those people who says like I'm not really into football, so I say the Oscars are my Super Bowl, right? Like
That's fair.
I'm one of those people. It's an opportunity to just kind of celebrate the things you love and root for the things that you are really passionate about, and complain when your team loses or in some cases doesn't even get nominated. And so I suppose it's like that. It's an opportunity to celebrate something that I love dearly, which are the movies. And in a broader scope for this conversation, just all of the awards. I mean, the movies, TV shows, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, and if you're not a Kansas City fan, then you probably believe the fix is in, as many of us do. The Oscars quite a lot. I will say I don't think we're going to get Bad Bunny at the Oscars this year, but we did have him at the Grammys. So
True.
That's another connection with the Super Bowl right there.
Yes, exactly.
So for you, I know you're primarily a movie guy, but it sounds like you do pay attention as well to the Grammys and the Emmys and stuff like that.
I don't. I loosely pay attention. I'll say, like, I know they're happening. I know things are out there and getting nominated. But we live in a world where the award shows have just kind of expanded exponentially as far as like the number
Right.
of different award shows, the different types of award shows. And so it's kind of gotten almost as difficult to pay attention to all the award shows as it is to try to watch all the things that get created. It's like there's just so much stuff out there. But I mean, I don't watch all of them. I do. I'm always curious, like with the Tonys, like what's big on Broadway this season, or same thing with the Grammys and the Emmys. And so I do pay attention to some of them. I've always been more of a movie guy, so I mostly am paying attention to the movie specific awards, but I am always curious just about like what else is happening out there.
Well, and let's start by just doing kind of a survey, because especially as award season has become more and more of a thing, there's a lot of talk about, well, this thing won these awards, and so that means that this is now a good shot to win at the next one, et cetera, et cetera. And growing up, like, I thought of the big four, and granted, this is very American perspective, which I'll acknowledge, but was the ones that you talk about for the EGOT. It's the Oscars for movies, the Emmys for television, the Grammys for music, and also for spoken word and podcast, and maybe one day I'll win a Grammy, who knows, and then of course the Tonys for theater, which, as a born and raised New Yorker, of course I understood New York theater is the only theater that matters, and that's kind of what the Tonys are. but recent, and many of these have been around for a while. I think the Golden Globes was the next one I heard about. And what is the Golden Globes? Because I think this is confusing to a lot of people.
I mean, the Golden Globes are just another of these different awards groups, and they do award TV and film and now podcasts. Like
Right.
podcasts have now been added to the Golden Globes. But the Golden Globes is specifically now you're stumping me because I can't remember the exact group, but it's the it's an international group of
Yeah, I thought it was the foreign press or something like that.
that's right. It's the Foreign Press Association,
Right.
and that's been I don't know. It's a group that's had some controversy over the years with Hollywood foreign press as far as being too focused on wanting to make sure that they're nominating the people that they like to have parties with and stuff. And so they had a huge when did there was huge outcry over like the lack of diversity in their membership in like in 2022. And then they restructured the whole thing and the new group and everything, and they started again. I can't remember if it was the next year or if they skipped a year, but anyway, they've theoretically are kind of back on track as far as
Right.
being a little more serious and nominating. I mean, they still kind of nominate some stuff that are, you're always like scratching your head at, like, okay, that's the Golden Globes for you. But at the time, they do seem to be on a better path now as far as like the what they're doing. So
Right. And they do, importantly, I think in both TV and in movies, do separate awards for comedy/musical versus I don't know, I think it's just called drama or something like that. And the topic of category fraud is one we will get into, and that certainly invites a lot of it. As anyone who has seen saw the Bear win for best comedy, there was a discussion about that and how well that fit.
or The Martian for films, like
Yeah.
that they still make jokes about that. The fact that Matt Damon, like just at this past Golden Globes, somebody was joking the fact that Matt Damon beat them for best comedy performance when his film The Martian is like very debatable that it's actually
It was very funny, but it was science fiction more than and survival.
and sci-fi action film with
Right.
funny moments for sure. So, but
Right.
that's always the trick. Yeah.
And I think that the topic of who gets to vote is also going to be an important one, because the big four that I mentioned are all the kind of industry people ones. And granted, again, it's the American industry, which becomes a thing, but it's like the people who are part of the Motion Picture Association, or people who work in motion pictures and stuff like that. Golden Globes we're talking about, that's a press one.
Right.
What are some of the other big ones that people are following during this time of award season?
Well, I mean, I think that there's generally kind of a whole run of them. There's a lot of them that are held by the various critics associations, like New York Critics Association, and then the same thing with the LA. Those are two that are earlier in the season that start getting giving people a sense as to where people are leaning. And then as it goes, you start getting more of you kind of continue with the critics, but you start getting other things like the BAFTAs, which were the announcements were made, I think, right before the Oscars. You also have the Film Independent Spirit
BAFTAs
Awards.
is the British Academy, right?
Yeah, the British Academy, correct. There's also the the Film Independent Spirit Awards, which are obviously more of the independent films, the ones that are not helmed by the big studios. And that award ceremony happens, like they've made that announcement too, and then that award ceremony happens like the Saturday right before the Oscars. So those two are kind of like right there on that last weekend. But yeah, so it's you kind of follow along with all of these different groups as they kind of go along from and I think that's another question that's often asked, like why are some of these organizations giving their awards out so early when the year hasn't even ended, right?
Right.
It's like, and a lot of it is because they're critics and they've likely had a chance to see everything already, and so they can kind of put their votes in ahead of time.
Right. No, that makes total sense. And I know also that there's also a number of kind of community, like specific racial or other communities. Like I believe that there's a specific Black
Yeah, the
awards one.
NAACP awards, right?
NAACP, yeah, I know. I don't know if it's GLAAD or one of the other big LGBT groups does an award show and
Yep.
stuff like that. And you brought up the timing of these, and I think that's particularly important because one thing you often hear is how much like does one set of awards either predict or even influence the later ones. And I don't know how much of an insider you are in this knowledge, but I'm wondering, are all of these other award shows happening after people have voted for the Oscars? Or are there people who are able to say, oh, well, this won the BAFTA award, so maybe I should give it a higher thought. Maybe that should be what pushes it over the edge for me in terms of which I vote for the Oscars.
Oh yeah, I mean it definitely. There's always that sense of overlap with some of this stuff. I mean,
Right.
with like these critics awards, all these different groups, they create early buzz before anything else. Same thing with like National Board of Review and Critics' Choice Awards and all these. Like you start getting their announcements and kind of get the conversation rolling before like sometimes the voting is even in or
Right.
the for the nominations. Like the Golden Globes happened mid-January or so.
Yeah.
And the Oscar announcements didn't happen until late January. Now,
Mhm.
I think that it happened right around the cutoff for when the due date was for people to get their ballots in for the Oscars. But still, with the Golden Globes at that point, all of those people who were getting their ballots in for the Oscars likely had kind of been then influenced by all of the promo and press and everything that was going on for everybody who is pushing to win one of the Golden Globes.
That makes sense. And I want to ask about that nomination process. It's certainly something we'll talk about. But just first, to get more of a background where you're coming from, I know you have worked as a professional in the film industry at various points in time. Have you at any point been, or are you still now a voter for the Oscars or any of the other big award shows or small award shows?
I never was for the Oscars. There was a point where I was voting with the Film Independent Spirit Awards.
Okay, cool.
So yeah.
Cool. And so, what is that? We'll focus mostly on the Oscars for this, but of course, we're going to talk about a bunch of them as well. How much do you know about the nominating process? Because I think a lot of times, even just that idea of who does or doesn't get nominated. One thing I've learned from you is that it's not just that the studios sort of push different people forward, right? How does all that work?
Well, yeah, I mean, anyone who's involved with a project, they were probably, especially these days, and especially if it's a bigger studio film that we'll just say is one that likely might lean toward any nomination.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably already paying attention to that at the time that they're making the film, and potentially already putting on a list of things to pay attention to when it comes to Oscar time, as far as the marketing and the pushing and all of that sort of stuff to get those nominations locked in. And so, yeah, the whole process really kind of, they're going to be pushing to get those in, and then the people will getting the votes in. But when they're voting, the initial votes, specifically with the Oscars, I can't speak about this with many of the other ones. Like I'm not sure with the BAFTAs, but with the Oscars, for example, the best costume,
Mm-hmm.
it's only people who are members of the guild for costumers that can actually vote initially for the films that are going to get nominated. So like the costume guild has, I don't know, it's not that big, like a couple hundred members maybe, right? And they're the ones who get the pool of all the films that are being considered for nominations. And then they pick, so all of their members will vote on what they think should get nominated for best costume. And then the Oscars, or they'll narrow that down to the top 5, and they'll make that announcement at the Oscar announcement ceremony, which they just had like a week or so ago. And so that's how the nomination happens. So it's the specific group who's involved with that. Now
Interesting.
the different one is Best Picture. Everyone kind of gets to vote for Best Picture. So really,
Right.
so like the costume designers and their guild members get to vote on costume and Best Picture. The
Right.
Writers Guild members get to vote on Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Picture. And so that's kind of how all of that
Right.
happens. And then everybody who's a member of the Academy gets to vote on the final nominations. Like
Right.
anything that's been nominated, they get to vote on that.
Okay. That all makes sense. And I'm guessing the logic there is, which I think makes some sense, although I can see it causing some problems as well, is that, I, as a viewer, can just say, oh, the costumes there look great, the costumes there look okay, but that a costume professional is going to be able to say, okay, this one might look to the average person a little nicer, but that one I know it was much harder to do, or shows like a higher level of skill and technicality or accuracy. Is that kind of part of the idea? Is that like the sound professionals are going to have a better idea of what should be the top nominated sound, best score, best sound editing, or something like that?
I mean, to a certain extent, but even there's campaigning involved, right? Like
Right.
they're going to be pushing within their own groups as far as like what they think deserves to win. And I know, like, take for example back to costumes, like Deborah Scott has been working with James Cameron for decades now. Like she won an Oscar for the
Right.
costume work she did on Titanic with him. She's been doing the Avatar films, all three of them, and then people are like, "Yeah, but what are you doing for costumes for these CG creatures?" And so, so it was kind of a surprise for Avatar, Fire and Ash. She got a nomination, but it's because when she does the costumes in these films, she's literally making, like, she and her team are physically making costumes of like what these what the Na'vi wear, along with
Right.
humans, and obviously they're just actually wearing their costumes. But for the Na'vi, she and her team are making, like, she designs them and they make these actual costumes, and then the digital artists take those costumes and scan them in so that they can then put them on these Na'vi characters that they're
Interesting. Okay.
creating. On top of that, they're also creating the costumes that the actors are wearing on set. That, it's just, I mean, it's the outfits that they wear so that they can get their body scanned and everything.
Yeah.
But even that, they're adding elements to it just to help the actors feel a little bit more like they're of, the
Right.
Na'vi people and stuff. And so I think they've been pushing to get noticed for that for years, and they didn't get nominations for the first two Avatar films, but they finally did for the
Nice.
third one. And I think it's just like, it's those sorts of conversations that Deborah Scott and her team and the Avatar marketing department and everyone is like getting out there so that all these other costume designers recognize all of that. But I mean, it's, specifically to that field, like, it's an interesting one because so often the history of that field has ignored present day costumes in films, and they
Right.
celebrate period costumes. Like, that's generally, like, it's so much more work to make these period costumes. But then you have a film like Clueless get released, which, I mean, has brilliant costume design in that film.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
it's top-notch costumes, and it didn't get recognized at all because it was a present-day film. And I think that film might be specifically a turning point where they started trying to pay attention to, well, there's more
Right.
being done in the world of costumes than just period pieces. We need to recognize that all of this is worth recognizing, and how we move the world of the world of costuming forward. So I don't mean to
Right.
go on a costuming tangent, but it was just a handy one to look at kind of the specific ways that these things happen within a category.
No, that's a perfect kind of microcosm because it opens so many of the doors and things I want to talk about. And the first, and this is more less a question, more just kind of a further comment. I really like hearing that because I'll say one of my major problems with award shows, especially with the Oscars and the Emmys, is that I've always thought animation gets a short shrift, and
Sure.
and I feel like this in society in general. But and granted, the Avatar movies are not animated the way we think of them. The way we think of like animation, like something like K-pop Demon Hunter or a Disney movie, but as it is certainly computer drawn stuff. And one thing I know that I've heard sometimes is that there are times where the acting performance in an animated movie is truly incredible. And I think a question comes up with, but then so if you wanted to nominate someone, who would you nominate? Would you nominate just the voice actor? Because the facial expressions and the body movement of the animated character are also a big part of, certainly we facial expressions and body movement are how we judge actors in live action. So should the animator be a part of that? And I think it's a much more complicated subject than the costume stuff you're talking about, but it feels to me like this could open a door to some larger conversations about, as our technology changes, how do we update some of our categories to recognize that these things are happening in new ways that don't quite fit the boxes of the old.
Yeah, and I think that's a trick. But I think there are organizations like the Oscars that have been around. Like that was like really kind of the first film award that
Right.
started back in the 1920s, and it's evolved, but it does take time to slowly evolve and to add new categories or to change categories. And that's, when you have an organization like this, that's just part of the process, and you just have to expect that it takes time. Like we're getting a first new category this year, and it's the casting awards for the casting department. So that's a big new bit of excitement that they finally have a new award.
Yeah.
Although there's also a lot of complaint about this first set of nominees for the best casting, because so much of it just feels like, well, it's just kind of a repeat of nominees from Best Picture. So it's not that exciting to see.
Right.
Like it would have been nice to see it feel like it was something different.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of complaints that why don't we have a best stunt award for the best stunt team? And that's been like, of the Oscars, that's the award that I hear most complaints about, the fact that they don't have it. But
Might be the way for Tom Cruise to finally get an Oscar.
well, yeah, but I mean, but that's the thing, is like so often these they take time to kind of add these categories, but that's why we also have so many other categories out there. Like in the world of animation, yeah, it's difficult to kind of get these things to shift as far as like recognizing the performances. I mean, James Cameron has been a huge proponent of pushing to get his actors nominated, whether you think that the performances warrant any nominations for the Avatar films, but he's genuinely been pushing. And like this year in particular, they've released a ton of things about the work behind the scenes that the actors are doing and how they're actually creating these performances for these characters.
Right.
And still, like, we still don't have anyone for motion capture getting nominated for an Oscar this year. It hasn't happened. But because of things like that, like you get things like the Annies, which is the animated awards, and that's something that you had mentioned, and they definitely work on nominations in variety categories for character animation, speaking to what you were talking about like the performance specifically of a character, and for obviously best picture, best TV show, best voice. Like they have all of these different sorts of things, and so they're getting all of that, they're putting it all in there and creating that. And I don't know if they have started doing things like for motion capture themselves, but it is stuff that's people are trying. And same thing with the stunts. Like the Toros World Stunt Awards have been around for several decades now, awarding a lot of different stunts. So when there's enough of a world of complaint about these sorts of things, we do see that, hey, at least other groups are coming together to try finding ways to promote what they think are the worthy ones.
Oh, I love that. And then I do think if they ever do a like, okay, we're going to include motion capture as part of something or make it its own award, the first award has to just retroactively go for Andy Serkis as Gollum. Because I remember like when that came out, a lot of folks were saying like, the voice acting he's doing is incredible. The body stuff it's an incredible acting physicality performance. But yeah, it just doesn't fit in any category that they had back then or even really now. So would love to see
he's
that.
really become the grandfather of the whole thing, and certainly warrants recognition in some capacity. Absolutely. If anything, it would be like a lifetime achievement award in something like that because of the work that he and not just the work he did in those films, but really, I mean, he became kind of the father of creating an entire world of actors who do mocap performances and leading to many other great performances, like blanking on his name, but one of the main guys who also ends up appearing like in the Planet of the Apes films with him.
Oh yes, I know who you're talking about. Well, and going back to the costumes one though, another kind of direction it wanted to lead me down that I think is a really important question to talk about is what do we mean by best? And
Yeah.
because like if someone asks me what's the best movie I've ever seen, I'm gonna tell like the first thing I'm gonna say is, well, do you mean the one that I enjoy watching the most, the one that most affected me, the one that I think was most important, the one that I think is the best technically?
Yeah.
And I'm curious. So like, I don't know, and so I'm curious, when these people get the ballot and they say, okay, we want you to vote for best costumes. Is there like a paragraph that goes with it that says, by this we mean the costumes that most evoke what the movie is trying to say, or the costumes that are the most visually breathtaking? Or is it literally just best costume and that's up to whoever wants to define it as how they define it?
Well, I mean, best is really just a label. It's shorthand. I mean,
Right.
I'd like to say everyone knows it doesn't mean objective truth. In
Right.
many ways, it means the best of the year according to this group of voters in this moment, right?
Right.
I mean, you could call it most acclaimed, most celebrated. It's just, I think it's just language that people understand. And I think the
I think isn't
important
the
part,
technical language like outstanding achievement in or something like that?
yeah, right. They
Yeah.
they have that sort of stuff. I mean, I think the important part isn't the word. It's a marker, right?
Yeah.
And and so yeah, I think a lot of people, I think people can get frustrated the fact that they call it best picture when it's like, well, that's not the best picture. I think it's I think people lose sight of the fact that it's just it's a label, right? It's just
Right.
it's shorthand for what got the award that year.
Right. But so there's no criteria given to when we say best costumes, these are the criteria we want you to judge by, or anything like that. It's really just this is it's the costume award, and each voter should say what they think is the best based on whatever criteria they're using.
Yeah, and I think in going back to costumes, since you just mentioned that one, I mean, the initial voting for it is going to be the Costume Designers Guild. They're going to be looking at, and they might have a different view as to like what they think is best. And again, every person is going to be different anyway. And also, they're also getting marketing materials and all these going to all these parties and stuff, getting pushed certain ways. So they might lean toward Deborah Scott for Avatar just because they had some great parties and they got a chance to talk to her and see the costumes and go, oh, I can totally see what you're doing. Yeah,
Right.
you should get nominated. But then you take that out of their hands and you put it in the hands of the entire Oscar voter pool, and they may have a totally different perspective on what best means. Like there's not a guideline that anyone is looking at
Right.
as far as like, oh well, it needs to fit these criteria in order to be best. Like there isn't any such sort of criteria. So they're just going to look at it on what they kind of like the most, and
Yeah.
think works the best. I always think an interesting one is best adapted screenplay, because it's like, well, is it the screenplay that was adapted the best from the material, the source material? Like when you
Right.
like, should you look at the source material and then subsequently look at the film to see how well they adapted it, or did they make changes that made it work even better in
Right.
cinema? Or is it just another opportunity toward a different type of best screenplay,
Right. Well, especially because given some of the literature, like if someone you mentioned The Martian earlier. The Martian was a book written in, 10 years ago, whatever it was. I'm bad with math. And then, a couple years later, a studio bought the rights to the book and adapted that book into a screenplay. That's a pretty straightforward process.
Yeah.
But if someone makes a movie of Romeo and Juliet today, like they're going from Shakespeare's script, which is, however many hundreds of years old, and has now been told many, many times over. Okay, well, if they're trying to tell a literal version of Romeo and Juliet, okay, maybe you can adjust that. But what about West Side Story or 10 Things I Hate About You, where it is a clear retelling beat by beat of the story, but it's a new setting and it's completely new dialogue. And I imagine that kind of thing, like, it would just drive you crazy going, how broad or how narrow are we defining adapted screenplay?
Yeah. and I think that's a tricky line because it's like, well, where is it? We'll just look at like the 1968 Romeo and Juliet that Franco Zeffirelli directed versus Baz Luhrmann's Romeo
Right.
and Juliet, or the Robert Wise 1961 or whatever West Side Story, or even Steven Spielberg's. Like, we're looking at adaptations, and that's an interesting one because is that an adaptation of
Oh yeah,
is
Spielberg
the
one.
Spielberg's an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet? Is it an adaptation of the 1960 West Side Story film, or is it just a new adaptation of the musical? Like, where's the
Right.
line for that chain that they went down with adaptations? Obviously, that's more of a Writers Guild thing to determine the
Right.
authorship and credit, but I think it boils down to like, what do you owe the original, and then what do you
Yeah.
owe the new audience, right? And it's like, is it something that, like, I mean, each time somebody's adapting it, it's and each generation that it happens in, it's reinterpreting different themes. The story itself is kind of this communal thing that we all have access to, and so I think the translation that you're getting across time and across culture and the way that they're doing it can reveal new meanings. And so I think that's what they have to look at is
Right.
it's are these, like, how is the adaptation recontextualizing the story for the time in which it's told?
Right.
It's not stealing, like West Side Story, I don't think you could say is stealing from Romeo and Juliet. Perhaps you could say it's arguing with it, and it's creating,
Yeah.
it's looking at a different way to kind of push the elements. And even Spielberg's, I think, is doing something different
Yeah.
than Robert Wise's one was.
I-
And so, yeah, I think when you look at a low effort remake that
Mhm.
is adding very little to it, then that's, I think, when you start looking, okay, well, then why do it? Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great example because, like, I mentioned 10 Things I Hate About You, which I think is completely different time and place, completely different dialogue, but a fairly faithful retelling of Taming of the Shrew.
Right.
West Side Story literally changes the ending. Like, forgive me spoilers for something 560 years old, but at the end of Romeo and Juliet, they both die. At the end of West Side Story, she lives. Maria lives, and that's a pretty fundamental change. And so you're right. I like that idea of it's kind of a it's a reexamining of it. It's a discussion with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let-
Yeah, and I think the idea of adaptation is it's brand recognition because it's something that's already out there, and so there's a chance at drawing in an audience familiar with that. But I think there can be, speaking specifically to ethics, there can be kind of a gross feeling of adaptations that feel like when it's only made because of the brand recognition, like that
Right.
becomes more of a problem for me, or when it's a low effort that just doesn't feel like they're doing anything with it, like I already talked
Right.
about. And when it feels like they're designing it to minimize risk but maximize profit, like that's when I think there's a problem.
Right.
But when they're doing adaptation as interpretation, I really
Right.
like that.
Yeah, I mean,
and I think that's when it's contributing something, not just consuming something.
yeah, like you mentioned Clueless not being nominated for costumes. I think it's probably true. I don't remember. I don't think it got nominated for adapted screenplay, but I feel like it probably should have been because not only with that's another. It's not from Shakespeare, but it's from the novel Emma,
Right.
which I think is Jane Austen. It could be a Bronte, but I'm pretty sure it's Jane Austen.
Yeah, right.
Let me go back to one other thing on this best of thing, and it's one that I've been asking a lot, and I've heard other people asking a lot, because I think this year we have a particular example of how we're gonna ask the question of how people define best, and I'm thinking of best song. And well, granted, what I'm about to say is very subjective. Many people may disagree with it. The general consensus that I've been hearing from a lot of folks is that there are two real leaders in that category, and that kind of fulfill different ideas of what best is. One of which is Golden from K-pop Demon Hunter, which is a incredible song. I think it's gotten a ton of radio play and people really love it, and also does a really important job in the movie. And then the other one is I Lied to You from Sinners, which is, some people think it is a fantastic song in of its own right. A lot of people are like, well, it's not one I would listen to on the radio that often. But in terms of the role that it plays in the movie is just utterly breathtaking and maybe one of the best things people have seen in 10 or 15 years. And so I'm kind of curious and Sinners being even more interesting because maybe another one of the brilliant song choices is Rocky Road to Dublin, which is not an original song and thus can't be nominated.
Right.
How do you
Right.
look at something like that in terms of like, okay, so how are you deciding what's the best song? Is it the best song in a movie? Is it the song that best helps tell the story of the movie? How would you look at something like that?
Well, yeah, it's funny because Pete and I just had a conversation about this over on our show, The Next Reel, about
Mm-hmm.
something similar when we were talking about the film score, not a song, but the score for Steven Soderbergh's The Informant. That
Mm.
score is so much fun. It's just a delight to listen to. Plus, it fits the movie really well. And I was like, I feel like it should have been nominated for an Oscar. And I was like, take out The Hurt Locker. I mean, it's a strong score that works very well in context of the film, but it's a difficult one to just listen to on its own.
Yeah.
And that began our debate. Like, what's more important? Like, obviously, if somebody's composing music for a film, their goal is to write something that works well in context of the film. Same thing with songs, right? I think we're running into that same sort of thing. Like Golden has this high replay value, it's pop cultural. It has this standalone hit energy.
Mm-hmm.
I Lied to You is integrated into the narrative. It has an emotional and tonal function. It's a little harder to listen to on its own, and I definitely think that's true. And so that becomes, are we awarding the song that's the best song or the song that's the best film song?
Right.
And I think that's the trick. And I don't think, again, this goes back to our conversation about like some of these things that we had in the past. It's like, I don't think there's a specific, like maybe the musicians who are voting for them initially
Mm-hmm.
are thinking more in context of that. But by the time you get to the entire Oscar pool, then you have to go, okay, well, how are the rest of these people going to be thinking about this? And I don't think people necessarily think about that. I think they largely think about how it works for them. And sometimes some people are going to be thinking how it works for them as as something that they can listen to. So those people will probably vote for Golden.
Right.
I think some people are going to be like, oh, but that scene in Sinners, the I Lied to You sequence, is one of the most powerful scenes I've seen the entire year. It wouldn't exist without that song, and they're going to vote for that. And so
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything wrong about thinking either way about it. And I think that's, I don't
Right.
know. I think that's the trick that makes it frustrating for some people because,
Right.
I think some people want to see Golden win
Right.
because it's something that they love singing or whatever,
Well, and I think that's true. And I think, I think you're being very generous with good reason for, reasons why people vote. But I think also from talking to you and talking to others, I get the sense of it's also that some people want K-pop to have a lot more respect in culture and they're going to vote for Golden, or others think that Sinners is not going to get respect it deserves and are going to vote for that. Or some people, as you said, they went to the K-pop Demon Hunter party and had a better time than they did at the Sinners party or whatever
Right.
it is.
Right.
So yeah, it does feel like and it is interesting to me how those kind of things become, which movie wins becomes a much bigger thing, and I'm forgetting the exact year. I think this has happened a couple of times, but I remember there were a couple of times where there'd be two different big movies that were really, Oscar baity and good movies, but they were about two different causes. Maybe one was about racism and one was about sexism, or one was about, classism, or one was about, immigrant rights or something. And the debate over which one should win becomes a debate over, well, wait a minute, why don't we pay more attention to sexism? So this is the movie that should win. Or wait a minute, why are, there haven't been enough people of color getting nominated, so it should be this movie that wins. And as someone who's very political, I mean, I have an ethics approach to media. I 100% get that. But I imagine also for people who really just love the award, that's got to be really frustrating because, sometimes like this issue might be more important, but this other movie is just better, or whatever it might be.
Well, yeah. And I think that's generally going to be the problem, or the element that comes up when it's like two big issue movies. It's like the issues themselves may be very important and be pressing, and one might be more pressing than the other, The other film, though, might be getting favored, and it could just be that it's a better film, and that absolutely happens. I think, I think that's definitely something that that we run into with particular years and particular films, and people complaining about, like, how could they ignore the performance in this film? And some people, including me, might say, well, the film itself isn't as strong as a lot of people make it out to be. I think they're frustrated because it's an issue that's very important to them, and and some people think the film is so important because the issue is such a key one for them, and so they might not, I don't want to say be blinded, but it's it's possible that they just might not recognize when it comes up against other films that don't, and it doesn't even have to be 2-issue movies. It can be 1-issue movie versus a non-issue movie, and the non-issue movie just happens to be a better movie, but people who are fighting for the cause in that issue are very frustrated when they see that the other film is getting more recognition.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And I'll undercut myself a bit because I do think also it can go the other way, in terms of if there's a movie about an issue for a group that I'm not part of, and so I don't really know why that's such an important issue, I might undercut that movie somewhat. But also a lot of it is also just your own, this can apply to issue movies, but also I know the year my mother died, I thought Mamma Mia 2 was one of the greatest movies I'd ever seen because it was a movie about someone whose mother had died, and do I still think it's a great soundtrack? Yes. Do I think it's probably not as good as I thought it was? Yes. But did I cry like a baby throughout the entire movie because my mother had died and I was seeing a movie that spoke to me on such a personal level? Of course, and like if you put a ballot into my hand 2 weeks after I saw that movie, I'd vote for it for Best Picture. And someone would wonder why the hell Mamma Mia 2 gets voted for, But I think all this stuff happens.
Yeah, I think that's very, very much the case. And I think you even see that with some other people's, like, this isn't necessarily awards, but, every year in, like, not every year, every decade, there is a new poll done of writers and directors. Directors and critics. Actually, I don't even think it's just directors. I think it's just filmmakers and critics every year, done as a big decade poll, looking at where they get to say what their top 10 films are. And I think that's the an opportunity for people to shout from the rooftops about particular films that they love. And I think it's always funny because certain things always rise to the top in people's lists, and as they expand the pool, obviously it's changed. Like this past round, they Jean Dielman, a French, like a 3-hour film following a housewife, not even a housewife, just a woman at home cooking and cleaning and stuff like that, ended up making its way to the top. But then you look at something like Quentin Tarantino and his list, and it's always like, things that no one else is voting for, but they're things that he loves. And I think that's what's fun to look at with those lists, to see what people are pushing.
I think that makes a lot of sense, because I think a lot of times one of the biggest problems with these awards discussions is the idea that we're getting to what is the objective best. And the fact that there's no such thing. It's always going to be subjective, and there are technical aspects we can look at. We can, large consensus and look back and say what happened there. But, things that are that are acknowledging themselves as purely subjective, I think in that way are a lot easier to appreciate.
Yeah.
Give me a second. There's one other thing based on that I was going to mention and then move on. The best songs that, it doesn't matter. Okay. Oh yeah, I know it. And just to go on the Sinners thing one more second, I think that here's another thing where I've seen in that I'm definitely one of the people who think Sinners was the best movie of the year. I want it to win all the awards. And among the people who feel that and who are worried that it might not win, and maybe it will, we'll see, but I think it has a couple of strikes against it in terms of traditional history. The biggest, obviously, I think, is racism. And I think there are going to be people who are uncomfortable with that movie because of the racial story that it's telling. I think that's much less of an issue in Hollywood than it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but it's definitely still a thing. And then there's a lot of folks like me who are like, yes, that is absolutely an issue. It's 100%. But also it's a genre movie. It is a vampire movie, a horror movie, which have traditionally also not done well at the Academy. And like for me, I know it's going to be that it's just this really interesting conversation I'm seeing online of people, and sometimes not being as sensitive to it as they should be, but for the most part, people being like very aware of the racism issues, very aware of that kind of stuff, but also trying to get into the conversation. There's also a bias against, and in many ways, I think Sinners is not a horror movie. It's a movie that uses horror as a plot device as a metaphor to tell the story of racism and classism and all that. But still, it's that genre bias comes in as well.
Yeah, and I think the genre element, I mean, it's definitely shifted over the years. I mean, it's been a slow shift, but we have seen genre films getting nominated over the decades. I mean, Star Wars got nominated in 1977, and E.T. 5 years after that, and we had the Lord of the Rings
Hopkins
trilogy
won for Silence of the Lambs,
right, horror film. And you had the Lord of the Rings films, and District 9 was nominated, and so we are seeing this. And then recently we've seen a spate of other horror films getting nominated and recognized, like Get Out. And I think we're seeing more of that. And I hate using the term elevated horror, but that is a term that started like 10, 15 years ago with some of these horror films that were taking on more serious themes. And I hate using it, but I mean, I think those are the ones that the Oscars are recognizing is
Right.
some of these films that are trying to say a little more and do a little more. It's not just a straight up slasher film. There's a little more meat to it. And
Right.
and I think that's what's being recognized. And so I don't know. I'm curious to see, because Sinners is my favorite film of the year too. And I know you're not as much a fan of One Battle After Another, but I equally love that film. I think it's fantastic and just as worthy of winning all of its awards. I think they're two amazing films, and it's great to see these two films up against each other, because that I think is going to be a genuine surprise as to like how it's going to shape the Oscars. I mean, if it were me, I would give everything to Sinners as well, but I don't know if that's exactly how it's going to go. This is another thing that I think is interesting is like, sometimes Oscar voters like to spread the wealth. Sometimes they don't like to spread the wealth. And you just never know, right? And especially when you have surprises. Like, I think everybody wanted Delroy Lindo to get an Oscar nomination finally, but I don't think that his chances had been as high initially. And so it was a great surprise when he got a nomination. So that kind of threw a whole shift in like, whoa. We were kind of, debating Stellan Skarsgård taking Best Supporting Actor versus I can't remember or one of the two guys from One Battle After Another, Benicio del Toro or Sean Penn. Like, it was kind of like between those three, and then suddenly Delroy Lindo's in the mix, and they're like, oh crap, now what are we gonna do? And so
and that's another great example of let me do it again. And I think that leads into two things. One, just to kind of reiterate what you were saying before about the casting award. To me, Sinners is a great example of why casting awards are needed, because frankly, I think Delroy Lindo is probably the most obvious choice. I think Miles Canton and the guy who played the vampire, I can't remember, are both also standout supporting actor performances. And there's three great women, who could be supporting actors in that movie, supporting actresses. So I'd love to see it win Best Cast. But also, this leads to two words that you taught me that I want to hear you just talk about a bit more, because we haven't really talked. We've been talking about the problems, but not in specific ways. Category fraud. What is category fraud?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a frustrating element. We talked about this a little bit back when we were talking about like the Golden Globes or other awards that have best drama and then best comedy / musical. Right. And then the complaint that people have why is this here in best drama when it's a musical and it should be in best comedy or musical, or vice versa? Well, this is a comedy. Why is it in best drama or whatever? But then we run into that same issue with, it's become a much more prevalent issue in the lead versus supporting categories. And often it used to be where like Gina Davis and Susan Sarandon would both get nominated for Best Actress in something like Thelma and Louise. And what started happening is that they would, or at least what people would say, I think probably only the the actual the polling service who actually runs the awards actually know. But people say, well, they canceled each other out, and then this other person got the award. I mean, this has been going on forever. 1950, we had Betty Davis and Ann Baxter both lose Best Actress to Judy Holliday, and they were in All About Eve. She was in I'm blanking on her movie, but she ended up winning. And people are like, well, it's because they were competing against each other. Who knows if that's actually the case, but that's been the complaint forever. And so now you've really entered this world where they're pushing only one person as lead. And so you have something like The Favorite, where, I mean, really, like, who is the lead? I mean, Olivia Colman won for it, but Emma Stone and Rachel Weisz really kind of had just as much meaty roles as she did. But they gave Olivia Colman the lead nomination and the other two supporting, where they all had very close to equal screen time. And you have something like Green Book, and it's probably a terrible example to talk about because the film is a frustrating one, but Mahershala Ali wins Best Supporting Actor when he's just as much a lead actor in the film as Viggo Mortensen. And and that's frustrating. And sometimes some people realize, like Viola Davis, she kind of said, I was getting frustrated with either not getting a nomination for lead or losing lead. And so when it was Fences, she, I think, ran as Best Supporting Actress. And I think that was a choice she made, and she ended up winning. But should she have? Or I don't know. That's the thing I think that ends up frustrating me the most, is like the lead versus supporting battles and how they're determining who they're putting where.
No, I think that's really important. And I will just say that the two lead actresses from All About Eve competing with each other for the award so that neither one of them wins is incredibly on brand for that movie. But other than that, who decides? Who, is it the not like who decides, what performance from a movie is going to be thought of as either actor or supporting actor?
I think a lot of conversation likely happens with that, as far as the studio. And I'm sure, I'm sure it's become much more complicated these days. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if they have a whole marketing department at each studio who evaluates the likelihood of who should be able to get a nomination for anything in particular,
right.
And which one's going to have a better chance. Another interesting thing that falls into this that we didn't mention is that they've stopped allowing actors to end up competing against themselves. And I can't remember at what point that was, but for example, I know this is something that you had brought up, that you thought Timothée Chalamet should have been nominated for Dune Part 2 instead of the Bob Dylan biopic. Right. But as an actor, like, he was picking the one that had probably the most likelihood of success.
Because it's not a genre movie, and it's a biopic, which Hollywood loves.
And so he probably chose to push for that one instead of Dune. And so that was probably a choice that he made in the process of all of this and what he was going to get behind. And he could probably tell the studios, like, I want to get behind this one, so don't put me in for that one. And if they, like, if Denis Villeneuve and the whole team behind Dune Part 2 had started kind of putting a plan together for how they wanted to market it, and then Chalamet said, I won't support it, I won't get behind it, they probably just say, well, okay, let's just drop it and push for other things.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So it's the studios that are kind of officially putting things in for nomination, but also that it's very strategic. And I imagine that sometimes from the studio's perspective, there might be a conflict of interest in that, if a studio makes two movies and it thinks that there's a good actor in both of those movies, and maybe both should qualify for Best Actor, but it thinks the one in movie A has a better chance, so it puts forward the guy from movie A in Best Actor and the guy from movie B in Best Supporting Actor.
Well, yeah, and I think also you have, like, there are times where the studio is behind certain things.
Right.
But then you have things like Kate Hudson getting nominated for Song Sung Blue. she, like, my understanding, I don't know if I know all of this, but I don't think there was as much of a push behind the from the team doing the film. I think a lot
Hmm.
of it was her, and she made herself visibly present, putting herself out there. I think she was going to karaoke bars and singing Neil Diamond songs and stuff like that. Like, I think
That's awesome.
I think she was really kind of getting into the whole thing and the spirit of it to try getting people to recognize her and
Right.
her performance in that particular film. And so I think, like, that's an interesting element that you have. And then sometimes, people really surprise you. I can't remember the actress's name who won for Precious, or whatever it's called, Precious, a novel
Hmm.
based on Sapphire, or whatever the crazy title is for that. But that she did no campaigning at all, and
Yeah.
her performance was enough to kind of stand out, and people just recognized it. And so
Hmm.
it's one of those things where you have a wide variety of ways that things get
Right.
out there. And this is an interesting thing that certainly speaks to ethics, but um, the movie To Leslie that came out a few years ago with Andrea Riseborough starring in it had some major, like, she got a nomination at the Oscars, and then suddenly there was all this conversation about these actresses like Kate Winslet and some other people who had been holding private screenings of the movie to try getting people to recognize her as somebody that deserved a nomination. And I can't remember how the screenings happened, but in some capacity, it was not how it was supposed to be done as far as the Oscars rules. And so
Yeah.
the Oscars said, "Oh, we're going to pull Andrea's nomination. She shouldn't have gotten a nomination because people were not campaigning properly," and that created its own blowback because of
Yeah.
that. But then you watch the movie and you go, Jesus, that is an incredible performance. She absolutely should have been nominated. But the problem is, it's a small film, and so it didn't have the big budget that some of these other
Right.
bigger studio films did, and so it helped having some industry insiders kind of pushing for it.
I mean, I'm someone who's very politically involved and very politically focused, and so I've been pushing for campaign finance reform for a long time. So maybe we need to extend that to Hollywood as well. And I've been also thinking this whole time that what really I think the Oscars need now is exit polling. Because we need to know.
Oh,
We get to know why do people vote the way they do. Um, uh, Putting humor aside, though, and we're already an hour, and I don't want to take too much of your time, so I'm just going to have one last question and then
yeah.
let you kind of talk about things. Um, but it's one that's very dear to my heart, and I know here's an area we disagree, but because for me, I think some of the best movie watching experiences I've ever had have been on a screen at home. And you know when I was a kid growing up, even maybe like 20 years ago, Emmys and Oscars, there's a clear bright line between the two. And there were sometimes what we would call made for TV movies, but they were always understood to be, the production values, the budgets, much, much lesser, nothing that would ever be thought of as Oscar worthy. Today, that's not the case. And there are some great movies, I think, being made and there have been some things on Netflix and other things like that have gotten nominated and I think have won some awards. And I want to kind of talk about that generally, but I'll ask you in specific about what I thought, honestly, is for me up there with Sinners as one of the best movies of the year, but didn't get any nominations. And I know that there's some specific reasons why that is that I want to hear you talk about. And that's Wake Up Dead Man, the third of the Knives Out movies, which was a Netflix movie, but that came out very late in the year, which is certainly, I think, a part of it. Um, and also, it's on Netflix. My understanding is it was released in a very small amount of theaters, but specifically so it would qualify for nominations if it wanted to. But then I know some other things happened. Why isn't Wake Up Dead Man anywhere in the Oscar conversation?
Because it's not as good as either of the first two of the Knives Out movies, I think. And I think and this speaks to, people and their tastes and stuff. Like, I thought Wake Up Dead Man was the worst of the three. I know a lot of people
Mm,
loved it. I would have put Knives Out, the first one, up for more awards because I
right.
thought that of the three, that was the strongest and the best.
Well,
And I think that they've kind of chronologically gotten worse. But I mean, to your point, yeah, like anything that streams, if they want to get into the awards conversation, they have to have a release of a certain length in certain cities, generally LA or New York, and it has to play for, like, I don't know, a week or two in
Uh-huh.
theaters in order to be considered. And so that's why so many movies get those releases, and even movies that like we don't get in the middle of the country until some point in January that are awards considered films.
Hmm.
They were released usually in LA or New York like back in mid-December, mid to late December.
Right.
And so that's kind of why, because they have to have had that qualifying release in order to get it. And Netflix has decided to get into the game by saying, okay, well, we're going to release everything long enough with a qualifying release so that it's considered, and then it just is off of
Right.
there. I mean, same thing was they did with most of their, well, I shouldn't say most, but they certainly do with a lot of them, like House Full of Dynamite, Catherine Bigelow's
Hmm.
movie that had a release. Train
Right.
Dreams played in theaters, so all of these movies from Netflix played, and I think that Wake Up Dead Man just didn't catch the attention of as many people as like Train Dreams obviously did.
Okay, well that's interesting. 'Cause maybe I'm mixing something up, but I thought I'd been talking to you, and you'd said that there was that like Netflix had specifically decided not to put that movie forward for nominations for particular reasons. Or
Well,
am I?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I have no idea what they were
Mm-hmm.
actually pushing. Like, I don't know if I know the specifics of which things they were pushing for awards, but they still release them in theaters just to say that if they
Right.
decide they're going to push it, that and try to get like the drive for all of that and put the
Mm,
marketing money behind it, it already had its theatrical release, you know. And I think
right.
that's largely why Netflix just does that, because I mean they really never know until the conversation starts happening about something, you know.
Right. Well, okay, and I guess that makes sense. And I guess maybe that goes back to the studio thing I was mentioning before about movie A and movie B, is that if Netflix thinks this movie has a better chance, then maybe it's not gonna. It's not an official thing, but it's maybe not going to push that one forward. Because certainly, I thought that if nothing else, even if not for Best Picture, that I thought it might get like Josh O'Connor might get a nomination for acting. But I can understand that, and perhaps if it did, with both him and the guy who plays Blanc, whose name I can't
Daniel
remember.
Craig.
Craig. Yeah, I can imagine there we've had a debate about who's the best actor and who's the best supporting actor and things like that.
Yeah, and I mean for me that's part of my frustration with that
Yeah.
film is that it's been Benoit Blanc's stories, but then it really kind of, he's just kind of a supporting player by the time we get to that third one, and it just seemed
Yeah.
strange structure for me. But yeah, I mean I enjoyed Josh O'Connor, but again for me is like it wasn't like as fascinating as some others. But again, it all boils down to personal taste in so many
Yeah.
ways.
No, that's very fair. That's very fair. All right. Well, any last things that we didn't really get to cover that you want to kind of just hit bullet point or throw a question out there?
I don't think any last things. I just think it's important to know that awards aren't perfect. I mean they're biased, they're political, they're human, but they're one of those systems that can help redirect attention toward craft and storytelling. We didn't really talk about that, but instead of just popularity or clicks or box office or anything like that, it allows us to get a conversation going about what else is out there and what people should watch. And I think that's the value that I think that I take away from it is looking at things that represent the zeitgeist of a particular point in time. Like what were people interested in? What were they talking about? What wasn't worth talking about 10 years later? And you can really kind of capture a moment in time with these. And I think especially today where movies can vanish overnight, I think it's still worth something.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think you can, not that Hollywood is a perfect barometer of anything, but certainly, we talked about there was a long, not that Hollywood is a perfect barometer or anything, but I think there's something interesting about saying like, okay, how can we track the development of conversations around race based on when movies made by people of color or actors of color or other folks like that start getting nominated, or I could imagine if 30 years from now you wanted to teach a political science course or a sociology course on America during the Gulf Wars, looking at when was, I think Hurt Locker got nominated and won. I think it was the first really kind of pretty solidly anti those wars movie. And then all of a sudden, a number of those movies got nominated for things going forward. Some of which I think were quite good. Others of which I think was just people in Hollywood saying we hate these wars. We're gonna have a particular love for anything that's against them. So yeah, I think it's interesting to look at what wins. It's interesting to look at what doesn't, and see, okay, what does that tell us about where things are going right, and often a lot of times what's going wrong and what do we need to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a helpful glimpse into a past and present of like how things are shaped. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most, this is pretty tangential to the Oscars themselves, but I think one of the most interesting conversations that I've heard in terms of, and it was one that I think was important for what folks like myself to really stay out of for the most part, but listen to, but in terms of, masculinity and standing up for Black women and all sorts of things like that, was when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock at the Oscars. And like that just led to a lot of nonsense and racism, and sexism, but also a lot of really great conversations that I think were really interesting to hear. So interesting stuff.
I don't think that was a great moment for the Oscars or for Will Smith or for many things. I think that was a very problematic moment, but yeah,
Mm-hmm.
a whole other conversation behind that.
Yeah, no, and I hear that, and it launched a whole other set of conversations that I thought was interesting. So,
yeah.
But and I will admit, as we can talk about all the serious parts of it, I have come to love on TikTok the people who will just go through and both praise and rip apart the red carpet looks. So a lot of great things there as well.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing too. It's crazy how that's created a whole world. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, Andy, thank you so much. I assume most people on here know you, but for those who don't, where can they find you?
Yeah, people can find me and the shows that I'm a part of over at trustory.fm. That's TRUSTORY.fm. I'm on The Next Reel with Pete Wright. I'm on Movies We Like with Pete Wright. I'm on CinemaScope is a solo show that I do, and then I'm producing a lot of the other shows on that network. So yeah, check it out over there.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. Please check out all the great things happening on True Story. Of course, I have another podcast called Star Wars Generations, where we're going through. Of course, I have another podcast here on this network called Star Wars Generations, where myself, a grumpy Gen Xer, a millennial, and a Gen Zer get together to talk about Star Wars and why we love it and what we have problems with from our different perspectives. The new trailer for the Maul show has just come out. We're really excited about that. We're going to be putting out an episode both talking about that trailer while talking about the first time and also talking about when Maul comes back in the Clone Wars, and we learned that yes, he didn't die in Phantom Menace, but he's still around and he's still going to be a big character. So check all that out. Please check out all the things Andy is doing. And most importantly, on behalf of myself and all the great people here in Minnesota, fuck ICE.